morning. How are we? Good. All right. Love it. One guy is good. The rest of you are like, it's been a week. Hey, glad to be here with you guys together today. My name is Chris Cummings. I'm the lead pastor here at Doxa. And if today is your first day with us, I first just want to start off by just saying thank you for trusting us with your Sunday morning. We do hope and pray that this place will feel like home for you very easily. Also, on your way in, you should have received a program that looks like this. On one side is a list of announcements, and at the bottom of that section is a little connect card. If today is your first day with us, we would just love the opportunity to connect with you and to help you get connected as well. And one of the best ways for us to be able to do that is for you to fill out that card. Once you fill it out, you can tear it off the bottom and do one of two things with it. You can either put it in the offering baskets when they get passed later on in the service, or you can take it to our Connections lobby. That's right when you first walk in. That's where our team will be once the service is over, and we would just love the opportunity to meet you, introduce ourselves to you, and give you a gift. Say thank you for joining us today. And so again, we're just incredibly glad that you're here. We've been in a series now for quite some time. When I say quite some time, it's been about 20 plus weeks working through the book of Hebrews. And when it comes to the book of Hebrews, the reason why this book was written in the first place was because there was some people that at this point in time were struggling in their faith. They had been receiving persecution and hardships and difficulties, and now they are being tempted to drift away from Christ altogether. And so what the author of Hebrews does is he's writing specifically to them, and last week what we saw was the predominant command that the author of Hebrews is wanting us to do. He tells us that this life we're on is like a race and that we are to run this race with endurance. And last week, as we looked at this race that we are to run, what we've noticed was that this race is a very much so an agonizing race, that it is a race that requires endurance. But not only that, but this race is also a race worth running. It is a race that is worth the endurance. And here's the thing, if we are going to truly run this race faithfully to the end, we have to be ready to deal with the pains and the sufferings that come into our life along this path. I heard one pastor say this recently. He described our culture that we live in like this. He says, there's never been a culture with a lower threshold for pain than ours. And here's the thing, I think he's absolutely right. I think for many of us, we do not have the tools, nor have we been equipped to deal with the pain and the suffering in our life well. For many of us in our relationships, when things become difficult, when turmoil arises, what we tend to do is instead of working through the pain and resolving the conflict, we just ghost each other and go our separate ways. Because for many of us, that's easier than dealing with the pain itself. Oh, that when other pain rises inside of our heart, that what we tend to do is to run towards distraction. We fill our days with endless entertainment to get our minds off of all of these things, because we know that if we give our mind just a little bit of space to breathe, it's going to run down these trails, and we don't want to go there. We constantly, when it comes to pain in our life, we try to numb it. Remember years ago, whenever our kids first came into our home, we have 4 awesome kids in the Cummings house. We fostered and adopted all of those kids. I remember when they first came into our home, one of our children, who I will remain nameless, okay, had a very low threshold for pain. And this particular child at one point fell down and scraped their knee. And when I say scrape their knee, I mean like nothing on their knee looked bruised or damaged whatsoever. Like there's no scar, there's no blood, nothing. Like they are totally fine. And for the entire rest of the day, that child walked around our home limping everywhere they went. They went to bed, the next morning woke up, came down the stairs, was walking fine. We told them, oh wow, looks like your knee's feeling better. And then they started limping again. That is a picture, I think very much so, of us. That when it comes to dealing with pain and suffering in our lives, for many of us, we don't have the proper tools. We haven't been equipped to deal with it. And yet, if we're going to run this race well, We got to be able to deal with the suffering in our life. And what the author of Hebrews is going to do today is he's going to point us to the reality of our suffering. And he's also going to tell us how we can properly run this race and endure to the finish and deal with the suffering and the pain that is inevitable in our lives. And so if you have a Bible with you, go ahead and open up. Hebrews chapter 12 is where we're going to be. We're going to start in verse 3. We're going to end in verse 11 this morning. If you don't have a Bible with you, don't worry. All the verses on the screen behind me so you can easily follow along. And if you don't own like a physical copy of God's word, we'd love to give you one. You can visit our hospitality kiosk or again, our connections lobby before you leave today and grab a free copy for yourself. Hebrews chapter 12. We're going to start in verse 3. And as you're turning there, here's what I need to give you a quick disclaimer in this passage real quick. The passage that we're about to dive into is incredibly difficult. It is, I think, potentially the most difficult passage that we have come up against in the entire book of Hebrews. And here's the reason why this passage is so hard, why it's so difficult. It's difficult for two predominant reasons. It's difficult for us theologically. It's hard for us to wrap our minds around what the author is going to say. And it is also difficult for us emotionally. What the author has to say here is going to inevitably stir some things inside of us. And that's what makes it so difficult. See, here's the thing at Doxa, we are very much pro just walking through books of the Bible. That is our default way of preaching. We find a book of the Bible and we spend half a year just to walk through it. And the reason why we are doing that is because it forces us to deal with passages like this. Passages that we would otherwise want to skip over entirely. But I'm letting you know right now, we are entering to some very difficult waters. And yet at the same time, here's what I also know. If we're going to be able to run this race with endurance and deal with the pain and the suffering in our life, we have to have a right understanding of our sufferings so that we can truly endure to the end. And that's what the author is going to give us. And my hope and my prayer for us is that we'll be able to see as clearly as we can what the author has. And then not only that, but that we will be able to suffer well. And that in your life, when suffering comes up, that you will not waste your suffering, but that it will be for the glory of God. All right? So with that in mind, you have been warned, right? We're going to walk through this thing little by little by little to try to digest this as best we can, all right? Let's start verse 3. Look at verse 3 and 4 together. Here's what it says. It says, consider him, talking about Jesus, who endured from sinners such hostility. Now that word such is going to be massive for us here in a minute. Who endured from sinners such hostility against himself so that, for the purpose of, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. In other words, so that you might endure, so that you might be able to navigate your pain and your suffering well. Verse 4, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your own blood. What the author does is he picks up where we left off last week. Last week in verse 2, the author tells us if we're going to run this race with endurance, there's someone we need to look to. And what he tells us, he says, look to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith. Look to him. And now what he does is he continues that idea, and now he says, consider him. Consider Jesus. Ponder on him, meditate on him. In other words, don't just look at him and look away. Fix your eyes on him. And as he tells us to fix our eyes on Christ, what he immediately begins to do is he begins to compare the sufferings of Jesus with the pain and the sufferings that these people have been experiencing. And what he tells us is he says, consider Jesus who endured from sinners such hostility. That word such is a word of comparison. And what it's meant to do is one, it's meant to intensify the sufferings of Christ. In other words, it's like, look at the sufferings of Jesus. Look how great they were. He endured such hardships, extreme hardships. That's the idea. But what that word is also doing is it is comparing the nature of the sufferings of Christ with the very natures of the sufferings of these Hebrews at this moment. In other words, he tells us, Look to Jesus and look at how he suffered. He suffered by the hands of sinful men and women around him. And then in verse 4, he shifts it. And then he starts talking about them. And he says, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted the point of shedding your own blood. That sin that he's referring to there is not primarily internal sin within them. It is not primarily this entangling sin inside of them that they can't seem to get a grip on. That's not what he's referring to predominantly. He is primarily referring to the similar struggles of Jesus. He is primarily referring to the sins of men and women around them that are bringing upon them such great persecution that now at this point in their lives, they are being tempted to sin by drifting away from Christ altogether. That's what he's predominantly referring to. It's not internal sin within them. It is predominantly external sin around them that is against them. And he tells them here, he acknowledges their endurance. He says, up to this point, you've endured well. You've resisted well. You've not given in. In fact, back in chapter 10, he lists all the things that they've gone through. They've been plundered. They've been ridiculed. They've been mocked. Some of them have been imprisoned. They've endured a lot. But what he's also saying here is that you still need endurance because there's still a race to be run. He tells them, you have resisted well, yes, but not to the point of shedding your own blood, meaning that you have not resisted all the way to the point where you have died for your faith. He's saying you're not like the martyrs, not yet, who have given their life for their faith. You've endured, but there's still endurance on the horizon. And so here's what the author does as he lays the foundation for what he's about to say next. He clearly defines the source of their struggle and the source of their suffering and the source of their pain, predominantly as it being something that comes from the sin of men and women around them and that sin being against them. That's what he's laying before us. And what he says next is what makes this passage really hard. Because what he just said was that the source of their suffering and the source of their pain is from the hands of these sinful people around them. But what he's going to say next is that all their suffering and all their pain and all of this sin against them is ultimately under the sovereign hand of God. Look at verses 5 and 6. And have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? The author of Hebrews right now fears that they have forgotten something that they need to not forget. They need to understand. They need to remember in this moment. An ancient truth that they've maybe wandered from. And so he quotes the book of Proverbs and he says this. He says, my son, do not regard lightly the discipline, the sufferings that you're facing, the pains that you're facing. Do not regard lightly the discipline of the who? Lord. Nor be weary when reproved by him. For the who? Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastises every son whom he receives. This is where this passage becomes incredibly difficult, both theologically and emotionally for us. Because here's what the author just said. He says, I know that you are enduring suffering by the hands of sinful people. But he also says, make no mistake, that same suffering is God's discipline in your life. And it is under the sovereign rule and reign of God. And whenever we see that, for many of us, this is where we tense up a little bit, right? Like the question that's probably in most of our minds at this point in time is something like, does that mean that every pain, every suffering, every sin that I endure in this life is ultimately under the control and sovereignty of God? And the answer, as uncomfortably as it might sound, is yes. You see, for many of us, here's what we think about when we typically think about the relationship between God's sovereignty and humanity's sin. We typically think that there's a gap between the two. That we have our sin over here, God's sovereignty over here. And what happens is that whenever we sin, God sees our sin and then he reacts to our sin so that in his sovereignty, he then brings something good out of what was otherwise bad. That's what we typically think about. To put a better illustration to it, we think about the way God's sovereignty and our sin relate to each other as the same way that I relate to my GPS, okay? And if I'm driving somewhere that requires me to put the address in a GPS, that GPS is gonna tell me where I need to go. It's gonna outline the path. But if I miss a turn, the GPS is now going to reroute me to get me to where I need to go. It's going to react and then get me on a different path. And for many of us, that's how we view our sin and God's sovereignty, that we are to follow God's commands, we are to follow his instructions, but whenever we rebel against it, whenever we sin against him, then what happens is God reacts to that and reroutes us to get us back on track. That's what we typically think about when we think about the relationship between God's sovereignty and our sin. The only problem with it is that it's not what the Bible says. Hebrews is telling us that God is not reacting to our sin. God is sovereignly over the sin in the world. Now, that does not mean that God is forcing us to sin, nor is he tempting us to sin. He's not the author of sin. To put it like this, God's hand is not behind us. It's over us. His hand's not behind us, forcing us to sin. He's not pushing us towards sin, but his sovereign hand is over all of our sin, which means that every sin and every evil act that happens in this world, God sovereignly allows it to happen. He is not the author of the sin. He allows it to happen. And at the same time, that evil act and that sin is a part of his sovereign plans and purposes in the world. That's what we're talking about here. We see this the most clearly in the story of Joseph. Remember the story of Joseph in the Old Testament? Joseph is one brother of 12. Their father is Israel, and Joseph clearly is the favorite child. I know we as parents don't say we have a favorite, but Israel definitely had a favorite son, all right? And it became incredibly clear that Joseph was the favorite, and his brothers became incredibly jealous of Joseph. So much so that they betrayed him and sold him into slavery in Egypt. And as the story goes on, Joseph eventually wins favor with the Pharaoh of Egypt and moves up in the ranks and becomes second in command to the entire Egyptian empire. Eventually, a famine hits the ancient world. Every other nation, every other family is suffering at this point in time, but the nation of Egypt is prospering. Joseph's families come to Egypt to seek refuge in Egypt and to avoid the famine. And because God had placed Joseph as second in command, they find refuge. Joseph's family does not die by the famine, nor do they die by the sword of Egypt, because God has sovereignly placed Joseph in that position. And as the dust settles from all this, at the very end of the book of Genesis, Joseph utters one of the most famous lines ever in the entire Bible. Here's what he says. He looks to his brothers and says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." I want you to notice real quick what this passage does not say. It does not say what you meant for evil, God turned for good. There's a famous worship song right now that literally says that the enemy meant for evil, God turned it for good. It's theologically incorrect. He does not say you meant something for evil and God made something good come from the evil. It doesn't react to the evil. He says you meant it and God meant it. You intended it and God intended it. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, which meant that every evil act that happened against Joseph, God meant for it to happen. It wasn't outside of God's sovereignty. It wasn't outside of God's control. It wasn't not a part of God's plan. God didn't see that happen and was like, oh man, didn't plan for this. No. God was sovereign in the midst of all of it. He meant for it to occur. And the same is true with these Hebrews. The suffering they're facing, God intended. He meant for it to happen. And as uncomfortable as it is for many of us, the same is true with every degree of suffering you face. Make no mistake. God is not caught off guard. He is not surprised. He meant for it to occur. He's not the author of the sin. He's not the author of the evil. But he meant it. Remember years ago, back before we moved here to Tucson to start Doxa, there was a tragedy that hit our city that brought our church to its knees. There was a night where there was a mom, her teenage daughter, and 2 teenage boys driving in a car. It was a regular night. They were doing regular things. They were on regular roads that they have traveled many times. No one suspected anything different on that night. As they were driving, they were coming up to a red light. As they came up to that red light, the light turned from red to green and they proceeded to go through the intersection. What they didn't know was that coming in the other direction on that intersection was another vehicle. That vehicle was driven by someone who had just been recently released from prison, and to celebrate his release, drank heavily and was intoxicated in the car. And on city streets, was traveling about 50 to 60 miles an hour down that road. The 3 teenagers in that car, all 3 of them were a part of the student ministry at our church. Good kids. We knew them. We knew their families. We had known them for a long time. And they proceed to go through that intersection not knowing that this car is barreling down on them. And as soon as they go through it, all of a sudden this car collides with the backseat of their car. The intoxicated driver walks away with almost no scratches on him whatsoever. The 2 boys in the back seat were not so lucky. They get rushed to the hospital. One of them in 3 days loses the fight and passes away. The other boy, who is a son of a father that I had known for over 10 years. I've been in their home, played basketball with these kids. He goes to the hospital and for weeks is struggling to stay alive. And after weeks of fighting for his life, he, just like his friend, loses the fight. Our church was praying and praying and praying and praying and praying for a miracle that never came. In 3 weeks, our church held 2 funerals for 2 teenage boys of 2 different families. In the midst of a tragedy like that, here's the big question that everybody started asking. Where was God in the midst of it? Because we just assume in the midst of pain and suffering that God's not there. And so the big question was, where was God? And here's the reality of what the Bible tells us. He was there. And he was sovereign over the whole thing. Everything that happened, he allowed to happen. He could have stopped it. He could have caused the car to swerve a different way. Could have caused the man driving that car to tie his shoes for a second longer so they would miss each other. He could have caused that man to not have a single sip of alcohol and not sin against him whatsoever. He could have prevented all of it. And yet what the Bible teaches us is that in his sovereignty, he allows it to occur because the evil itself was a part of his sovereign plan. And man, when we hear stuff like that, for many of us, now here's the question we ask. If that's truly the case, if God really could stop it and yet didn't, if he had that kind of authority, that kind of sovereignty and power, then how on earth is he good? How could a good, powerful, all sovereign God intentionally allows something like this to happen. And here's the thing, I'm not gonna stand up here and pretend like I got all the answers to all the things that God does. I'm not gonna stand up here and pretend like after that tragedy, I'm now able to look back and I can see all the good. I can't see the good from that right now. Still haven't been able to. The reality is the Bible tells us that God's ways, they're not our ways. His thoughts are much higher than our thoughts. I'm not gonna be able to stand here and tell you that I've figured out the mystery of all the things that God does. I don't know. But here's what I do know. There is only one hope. When you are in the midst of pain, and when you are in the midst of suffering, and when you are dealing with the deep tragedy of your soul, and that is the sovereign hand of God in the midst of your suffering and pain. It is the only hope for us in those moments. So often for us, in order to deal with the pain, we like to try to take God's sovereignty out of it. But here's the thing, when you try to take God's sovereignty out of the pain and suffering, you're left with a far greater problem. The problem that you're faced with is that when God's not sovereign over the pain, we're not guaranteed that good can come from it. What hope can you give the parents of these teenagers if God's not sovereign in the midst of their pain? You can't give them any. There is no hope for them in the midst of that. Losing a child is devastating, yes, but when their pain is purposeless and their misery is meaningless, that is a wound that will never heal. The only hope in the midst of the sufferings of our souls is the sovereign hand of God over your pain and over your suffering. And the Bible tells us that he's sovereign over all of it, which means that every sin, every pain, every evil act he allows because it is a part of his sovereign plan. But here's what it also means. It also means that your pain and every pain that you experience has a purpose. It's not meaningless, your pain. Every pain that you experience has a good, God-glorifying purpose. And that's the rest of what the author of Hebrews tells us. Verse 7, it is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our what? Our good. It is for our good that he disciplines us, that we may share in his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant. But later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Here the author of Hebrews tells us there's purpose behind your pain. Your misery is not meaningless. Your pain is serving you. It is doing something. It is for your good. What it's doing in your life is causing you to be able to share in the holiness of God, that it may yield the peaceful fruit of righteousness because you've been trained by it. It is doing something good in you. It has a purpose. Your pain's not meaningless. The author of 2 Corinthians says it like this, for this light, momentary affliction. Light, as in not burdensome, momentary, not forever. This light, momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. In other words, as you endure to the end, you look back on all that you suffered, and because of the glory around you, everything else pales in comparison and is described as light and momentary affliction. That's the glory on the horizon. Because God is sovereign over all of it, your misery is not meaningless. Your pain has a purpose, and it is for your good. That does not mean that the pain itself is good. The author tells us it's not going to be pleasant. It's going to be painful. It's not good. In heaven and in the new earth, like when Christ returns, there's no more pain, no more suffering, no more sin. It's not good. This is not saying that pain is good, but what it is saying is this, that your pain is for good. It's for good. You see, here's the reality. God is far more committed to your good than you are. Hebrews tells us that he's a loving father who knows not just what you want, but what you so desperately need. And he will bring necessary pain into our lives in order to awaken our soul and awaken our heart so that we can more clearly and fully attach our lives to his. J.I. Packer, author, theologian, once wrote it like this. He says, and still God seeks the fellowship of his people and will send them as gifts. He says, they're gifts, both joy and sorrow, to detach their hands from the things of this world and to attach those hands to himself. There's purpose in your pain. And that purpose is to draw you near to the throne of grace. Author, theologian, philosopher C.S. Lewis describes the pain of God as God's megaphone to rouse a deaf and dying world. It's to get our attention so that we may let go of all these other things and hold more tightly to him. God is more committed to your good than you are. And he will bring necessary pain and suffering in your life to detach your hands from these other things so that you can attach them more tightly to him. And here's the thing, for some of you in the room today, like you're going through it. Like for some of you, like pain and suffering is not like a hypothetical. It's not something that you once walked through. Like it is a present reality right now. And I know for some of you, it's hard to see God's good hand in the midst of all of this when there's so much pain and turmoil deep within your heart and your soul. And I get it. I've been there. And for some of you, you're thinking, how can I truly be confident that God is bringing about all these things and working all these things for good? How can I be confident? The way we can be confident is by looking where the author of Hebrews tells us to look. Look to Jesus and consider him. Because when you consider him, he gives you the strength for endurance, that you may not grow weary. You may not become faint-hearted. See, here's the thing. At the cross of Jesus Christ, what we see is we see the Son of God enduring pain on behalf of sinful men and women around him. He endures the pain. The pain was not a surprise in the midst of God's sovereign plan. The pain was a part of God's sovereign plan. He endured the hardship. He endured the pain. He endured the cross. He was mocked. He was slandered. He was ridiculed. He was spit upon. And he died and rose from the grave for you. We worship a God who is not distant from our pain. We worship a God who is acquainted with our grief. He is a man of sorrows. He stepped in to the pain. And whenever you're beginning to wonder if you can truly trust that God is going to bring about good in your life in the midst of the hardship and the tragedy and the pain, look to the cross, because what does God do with the greatest evil humanity has ever committed? What's his intended purpose at the cross? He uses it to accomplish the greatest good humanity has ever received. And so here's the thing. If you are struggling in this moment to trust the sovereign hand of God in the midst of your suffering, just look to the nail-pierced hands of Christ. Because in that moment where the greatest evil humanity ever possibly could do was committed, we also see our greatest good at the exact same time. Look to Jesus, consider him, and keep running. Let me pray for you.